Hi, welcome. Good morning. My name is Olaf Böhnke. I'm the Senior Advisor of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity and the Berlin Director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. Welcome and good morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning to this last event we are running here before Christmas. We want to do a quick review of the German elections, which took place in September 26th here in Germany. Have a conversation about the level of interference and the level of election integrity we have observed during these elections from different point of views, and then take our conclusions from the German elections and take them straight to the European level and discuss with you in the audience and our distinguished panel, which I will introduce to you in a second, what are the implications for the European debate, and also looking forward that we will have important elections coming up in 2022. The first will be the French elections in April and in June, and we want to discuss with you in our panel where we are when it comes to the debate on election integrity and what governments and institutions can do about it. We have here today the pleasure to welcome Viola von Kramont, who's a member of the European Parliament for the German Green Party, and she's also a member of the Inge Committee, which is specifically looking into foreign interference into democratic processes and institutions, and also with a specific focus on disinformation. Welcome, Viola. Thanks for joining us. With us is also Lutz Göllner. He's the head of division for strategic communication at the European External Action Service. And he's the one actually who has the specific focus on what kind of foreign-based disinformation is entering the EU. And so in that regard, we are glad to have you here as well, Lutz. And last but not least, Felix Carter is with us. He's a senior advisor to Reset Tech, an NGO, which is pretty much focusing on the role of social media platforms when it comes to the integrity of democracy. And in that regard, he's also an advisor to the European Commission and had a lot to do in a former position and was very much involved also to develop the interesting legislation called the Digital Services Act, which we will discuss in the second part of this conversation. Felix, great to have you. Thank you very much. And this event takes place in cooperation with our partners from Microsoft. We hosted a webinar on this already with the Berlin office 2 weeks ago, and we're glad to host this event now in cooperation with Microsoft's office in Brussels. As I said, because we are interested to take that debate now to the European level and feed in all the conclusions and recommendations we came up with. And so in that regard, it's great to have this cooperation. And without further ado, I give the floor to some opening remarks to Liga Rosenthaler. She's the Senior Director at the European Government Affairs section at Microsoft in Brussels. Riga, great to have you. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much for co-hosting this meeting with us. Very timely to discuss what's happened in Germany and also the implications for the rest of Europe. We're always very curious on a very wide scale to see how elections and differences in shifts in political parties coming to power will influence a wide range of issues, especially digital policy. But today we're definitely addressing disinformation. And my personal specialty is more cybersecurity than disinformation. But we see that kind of the hybrid environment where digital technology affects democracy is wide. And I think just as wide as this field is, the amount of stakeholders needed to address all of the challenges in this space. I'm pleased to have government, civil society, and industry represented on this in this discussion to kind of see how we can divide the tasks. And I think here the EU is a very big fan of toolboxes. So trying to fill this toolbox with all resources from different stakeholders is really key. So I look forward to the discussion in looking at really how technology has become the enabler of democracy, but it's also the biggest challenge to democracy. these days. And I'll keep my remarks short, but on the side of Microsoft, you know, big tech is certainly under scrutiny these days, and each company has a different approach. We try to look at what our services are and what we can address in this space and the partnerships we can have. On a global scale, we certainly address the need to protect democratic processes and cyber attacks against democratic processes. We've been happy to work with Alliance of Democracies on this point in working on a compendium of defending electoral processes under the auspices of the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. We've looked at how we can work with media companies to detect deep fakes, which has been a big concern, which needs certainly this combination of media and technology to be addressing how this new technology is manipulating society. But we also work with companies such as NewsGuard to address how really the sources of information can be manipulated and how we can really bring attention to each individual user of information to verify the integrity of sources. So those are just a few things that we've been looking on at. But I look forward to going to more detail on these points and seeing the views of others in this space to try to see where we can match government and civil society on the demands that we have and how we can form the best partnerships in this space. So I turn it back to you after a few more remarks and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Liga. That was a good opening, and indeed. So since I mentioned in the introduction a lot the buzzword disinformation, of course, what we also observed with our engagement of the Transatlantic Commission during the German elections was a lot of cyber attacks, and in that regard, I'm glad to give the floor to my colleague Carlo Census, who is a co-author together with me of the Election Risk Monitor report, in which we try to summarize not just what we had seen, but especially what other civil society organizations, academia, and other institutions had observed in the course of the German elections when it comes to any kind of interferences. With a specific focus on disinformation, but also on cyber. So therefore, I give the floor to Carlo. He will run us quickly through our key findings and also the key findings in the first section, and then later on, after a round of discussion with the panel on our observations from the German elections, we will then have a second presentation on the recommendations and the outlook for the coming month ahead, and then we will discuss the European dimension of it. So Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olaf. I will share my screen. I hope everybody can see this. I will provide a short scene setter and introduction to our research on the Bundestagswahl and our election risk monitor, just to provide some concrete evidence on what we saw and what we will discuss today. First, it must be said that Germany continues to be a prime target of election interference. There was a well-cited EU versus Disinfo Lab analysis, which came out last year, showing that over the last 5 years, Germany was by far the country most targeted by disinformation campaigns. This is also evident in our analysis that we did now for the recent election. But it's also important to note that the actual vote was secure. The actual vote was not undermined through an election interference, whether from a disinformation campaign or a cybersecurity attack. So in that sense, the actual vote is secure. But still, we saw a number of disinformation campaigns which attempted to undermine citizens' trust in government, in the institutions, in the democratic processes. The similar premise also applies in regard to cyber attacks. The actual election was not attacked itself, but we saw a number of cyber attacks throughout the year targeting parliamentarians, but also government institutions and the parties themselves. When we delve into the actual question of disinformation, it's first important to just state that there's a constant background noise of disinformation in the digital public discourse. The typical narratives in this regard are those topics which are most polarizing: COVID-19, vaccinations, but also mail-in voting and absentee ballots was questioned. The legitimacy of the actual election was questioned. If we look at who these actors are, we see that right-wing networks are most active in this regard, certainly also with links to the AfD, But political activists on both sides of the aisle were also engaged in spreading false narratives about specific candidates. The targets were in particular candidate Annalena Baerbock and the Greens, but towards the end of the campaign, we saw a rise in disinformation targeting the CDU and also Mr. Laschet, especially after the floods that took place in Western Germany. One component that we think is important to mention is the role of the media. Unfortunately, we saw that at times media, traditional media, news outlets picked up stories, false narratives that originated from social media and then spread them through the normal media ecosystem. Analysis showed that actually the source where people find and see disinformation is not only social media, but also television and normal newspapers. So in that regard, the role of the media in spreading disinformation has to be questioned and overthought. In regard to foreign disinformation, Russia remains the culprit and the country that is most actively trying to interfere in our elections. Russia Today, their main state media outlet, in this case, Russia Today Germany, has a very, very large online reach and engagement rate, to some extent even bigger than normal than traditional German media outlets, which should be cause to think about their role. They focus on polarizing topics, as I just mentioned. COVID-19 and vaccinations are the ones that are most prominent in this regard, and constantly try to undermine trust in democracy and polarize society by pushing controversial issues. We also, as Olaf just mentioned, looked at the cybersecurity component of the Bundestagswahl. Again, it's important to note that the actual vote was secure. Germans still vote with pen and paper, but still we saw a number of cyber attacks registered throughout the year. Those that are mentioned here are the most prominent. In January 2021, there was a big attack on the CDU party convention. We had several attacks on civil society organizations throughout the summer. And even shortly before the election, the Federal Election Commissioner was targeted and his office was targeted. To our knowledge, these cyber attacks were not able to successfully penetrate the systems and or steal information, but still they're worrisome. The most prominent attacks that actually took place throughout the year were several phishing email attacks on members of the Bundestag, not only on a federal level, but also on a state level, which shows the importance that also state elections, which many are coming up in the next year, can also be a target of cyber attacks and foreign election interference. The objective stays the same as we saw in past elections: steal sensitive information, then disseminate it into the public, trying to create a narrative about specific individuals or parties or government in general. We did see a change of strategy to some extent in regard to how to react to such cyber attacks. Shortly before the election actually took place, the EU came out with a statement publicly calling out Russia for their interference and urging them not to interfere in elections anymore. This public shaming, naming and blaming, or calling out the culprit is something that was not always existent, but we see a change of strategy on how to actually act and deal with these actors which continue to try to influence our election. With this, I will give it back to you, Olaf, as a first scene setter.
Thank you very much, Carlo. That was, I think, a very good opening, and with a lot of points we can come back in the conversation. So since disinformation was one of the key elements, let me first turn to you, Lutz, as the key guard of all the foreign interferences across Europe when it comes to specifically disinformation activities. So from your perspective, so you're watching the entire European Union influence space, or the public information space, better to call it like this. So what was remarkable from your perspective when you had a look at the German election? Was there something specific which you hadn't seen in the past month? What was specific to the German elections, or was this pretty much actually what you expected?
Thank you, Olaf. Let me just correct. We are not the hyper watchdog of everything that happens everywhere. I think that would be not in line with our mandate. But we are looking in particular at what foreign actors are kind of doing in our information space. And that is a bit the focus of our work. And maybe since Carlo mentioned it, I mean, we had seen already the trend that Germany is coming more and more in the line of fire. It's always, we need to be very careful with the methodology and with exact quantities, etc. Always depends how you measure it. But I think the trend is relatively clear. That has to do with politics, that has to do with the size of Germany, that has to do with its role. It's pretty clear, but there is a remarkable upping of activities, in particular from pro-Kremlin actors, let's call it like this. Second point that is hugely important is that election meddling happened in the past and it will happen in the future. And it is a bit, I mean, we need to be careful that we should only focus on the issue, can they really turn the elections or not? This is not the problem. The problem is not kind of the punctual change of percentages, but it's also the medium to long-term effect that we see in these events. It's the corrosive effect behind, it's the undermining of trust of institutions, etc. And that's why we need to be extremely vigilant. Third point is, yes, I think we all collectively, also in Germany, German authorities are much better prepared than maybe compared to 3, 4, 5 years ago. That is the good news. The bad news is it is still happening. So what we have seen just in a few elements is that a number of the rather well-known actors, I think Carlo mentioned some of them very clearly, continue to exploit kind of the vulnerable situation, vulnerable in the sense of polarized debates. I'm referring to Querdenker, I'm referring to specific political parties, etc. It's a very opportunistic amplification of these voices that is happening. Second point is an excessive focus on specific issues. And if we look at COVID-related issues, also, of course, a huge issue for the elections, the numbers that we looked at in terms of how often these outlets are focusing on the negative sides is quite amazing. So this excessive focus on these negative stories is a clear trend and is a very, very clear feature of all this. And then a third point, kind of in our own observations to round off, is that we need to be careful in just focusing on what is happening in the social media. We have a number of websites, we have a number of other actors outside of the social media platforms that are very active and that continue to reproduce in a non-organic way, sorry for using this technical term, so it's not a real debate, but just an amplification, an artificial amplification of these outlets. And I think when we discuss a little bit what to do in the future and how the DSA, the Digital Services Act, etc., could help, that's a point I would like to come back to, because it's one of the things that we discovered also. There is a quite systemic kind of amplification, reproduction of these narratives as well. I maybe stop here, Olaf.
Thank you, Lutz. That's excellent. And as you pointedly said, so it's a very timely debate. So because right now in Germany, in Berlin, we have this huge debate on if the German government should intervene into Telegram as the main platform, and that goes straight then to the debate, of course, that for the time being, actually, Telegram does not apply to the restrictions you would see under DSA because it's not a social media platform as such, at least as it is labeled right now. Great. And as you mentioned, so the huge amplification, Carlo mentioned this in the presentation. I turn over to you, Viola. So you were not a candidate yourself, but you, as a politician for the Green Party, had been in the eye of the storm of this what we had seen in terms of disinformation activities during the election campaign. So how did it feel? How did you, as a candidate, and not as a candidate, but as a politician who for sure actually also supported candidates on the ground, how did that feel actually? So was there something specific also in the sense that online debate actually gets offline? So as we see in that people, constituents address you and your election campaign, actually asking you questions, actually they got obviously from these places as described by Lutz, actually, where this huge amplification had taken place?
Yes, thank you, Olaf. Indeed, since I have not been a candidate this time myself, but of course we went out, we do the election campaign, and you can really hear and feel and see what Lutz has described as the discreditation of institution, of integrity of elections, of credibility of elections. So this distrust, which is continuously spread by some of the foreign actors, which then are being picked up and amplified by some of the domestic actors, is working very well. And you speak about Telegram, but even closed WhatsApp groups, you have no idea what is going on. And what we have been faced with this time, not just as a party, but since we had a candidate for the highest office, I think the attack were even heavier and in a different dimension. So if you saw the announcement of Annalena's candidacy, 5 minutes later, you could see all kinds of stories around her, naked pictures, all kinds of made up stories, which never happened. So it was really time. They waited until we announced her candidacy, and 5 minutes later, they spilled and spread it on Twitter and on different social media channels. So this was a very orchestrated and very well observed campaign against especially her. I think in the end, you could observe like 80% of the false information were on her, let's say, account or on her side, 20 on Laschet and 0 on Olaf Scholz, which also says a lot. Interesting enough. So obviously, somebody who has a strict position on Russia is not so well well received. Yes, we got, unfortunately, really weird stories. So I remember standing in a pedestrian zone in Lower Saxony and being attacked by older ladies. I will never vote for your candidate because she wants us that we cannot keep pets anymore. And I said, why? What? So, and something about taxes on something. And I said, where have you found it? Where have you had this? Yeah, it's written in my WhatsApp group here and there. So this false information were really channeled into those closed groups, be it a Telegram or WhatsApp, but very targeted to old pensioner ladies who have an open ear, especially on, I don't know, little dogs and cats. And of course, you don't have to try to convince her with a broader content and aspect on climate and your social affairs and whatsoever. They are lost, and I think that cost us quite a lot of credibility. I mean, of course, there were mistakes, there were strategic mistakes, communication mistakes, no matter. But this disinformation campaign played very well in this hands, especially on those target group. And I think that had a different weight on what we have seen, for example, in the European Parliament's election and now in the Bundestag's election.
And do you happen to know actually sort of how the party reacted to this? Because as you said, so it was kind of foreseeable that this kind of strategic campaign would arise, but we know from Michael Kellner, who was running the campaign, that the party prepared for it, but was also kind of overwhelmed by the level and the dimension of these kind of attacks, right?
Exactly. I think, first of all the narratives, all the made-up stories, all these generated stories, you cannot really be prepared for. I mean, in general, what we do in Inge and what many other do is how do we raise awareness for false information in the society as such? Yeah. How can people figure out what is true and what is false? How do we implement, I mean, strategies in the media that they have, let's say, a broader unit online also to counterbalance this false information instead of amplifying this? And everything like this, but a party alone cannot do this. This is a bigger society problem, and I don't think that the party was ready for that. I mean, as I said, there were many mistakes, but this counter disinformation strategy would be, I don't know how many people you would probably need, but just a one tweet or just a message to all the members of the party, what they sometimes tried and sometimes encouraged us, hey, you could go against this or that, and have you seen this? but this is simply not enough. You need a different approach, and you need a broader cross-party approach against those kinds of attacks.
Okay, which is a super bridge to Felix Kante, who had been very active also and engaged with German civil society organizations throughout the election campaign. You had also been part of a group which called or was going under the Campaign Watch. So you addressed parties, all parties actually, to agree on a specific code of conduct, how to run a digital election campaign, as we did from the Transatlantic Commission with our pledge for election integrity, but we focused more on individual members of parliament. So what were your observations from the campaign trail, specifically when it comes to civil society activities, and also the performance of the classical social media platforms like Facebook and others who had been blamed in the past a lot for being still the major venue for spreading disinformation? Felix, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Olaf. Thanks, everyone. So indeed, we worked with a bunch of organizations like Reporters Without Borders, Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, Open Knowledge Foundation in Germany, because all of us thought that there is a huge regulatory and transparency gaps when it comes to online campaigning, and that in the absence of a proper campaign oversight, there should at least be voluntary commitments, kind of code of conduct between democratic parties to make sure that that an online campaign basically mobilizes democratic forces and plays out in the interest of democracy rather than undermining it. It was a little bit tricky to help mediate consensus between the parties. In the end, however, actually all parties but the AfD and the Bavarian CSU did sign their own codes of conduct for the election campaign, and there was a strong consensus between parties, especially on the question of foreign interference. One issue where it was proved impossible to get strong commitments from any party is the issue of micro-targeting, the use of personal data to target personalized election ads. And of course, there it's a little bit like asking the alcoholic to regulate liquor or alcohol. That doesn't really work, because all parties at least think they are dependent on micro-targeting to mobilize their voters. Sometimes I wonder if that's actually true, and if that assumption that micro-targeting is so effective has actually been empirically tested sufficiently. But it's, at least for the time being, the kind of truth that we all operate with. You asked also about the role of online platforms. I don't think that there was a lot of reason to be positive in the end. We looked at it from several angles. The first one we just touched upon, which is micro-targeting. We realized that there has been large-scale hate speech targeted through ads ever since January, last December, basically at a moment when offline the election campaigns hadn't even kicked off yet. That of course already paved the way for quite polarized election campaign further down the line. The most worrying finding for us actually was those on hate speech, on digital violence and organized hate campaigns targeting the Greens, but women across the spectrum of political parties, actually female candidates, but also journalists ahead of the election. That was pretty rough, pretty damning. There are a lot of angles to this, but the one that we looked at, of course, most is the question of company accountability. And one experiment, for instance, that we conducted with Süddeutsche Zeitung was that we notified to Facebook, I think, 200 public posts that were unambiguously illegal, like calling to murder a politician, for instance. And Facebook only even reacted to those notifications in about, let's say, 50% of the cases, even though in Germany, as opposed to the EU level, there is a law actually binding the companies to handle user notifications diligently. So that didn't really work out. Then if we look a little bit beyond illegal content, disinformation, coordinated inauthentic behavior, as Facebook likes to call it, that was actually quite quite a damning picture as well. As in the European election already, we saw that AfD and other far-right actors, they employed fake accounts, for instance, at massive scale to artificially amplify extremist positions, all of that. All of these things that Facebook tells us are banned or outlawed, so to say, by their own terms of services, but their level of ambition when it came to like implementing their own community standards, their terms of services, was shockingly low, so to say. And this is, of course, if you, Olaf, now want to already build the next bridge, will lead us to the discussion on the Digital Services Act, where it's all about forcing the companies to comply with their own terms of services, to be diligent, and to identify and tackle risks to democracy in advance, rather than always just like explaining us how the misery could happen after the fact.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll walk that bridge a little later,
Okay.
but exactly. So you're absolutely right, and it was important that you also mentioned the German NetzDG, so the network enforcement law, which would also become an issue when we discuss the DSA, because we have that very strict, very much focused on hate speech law already in Germany. It's kind of controversial, so the intention definitely is good. I think everyone would subscribe to that, but of course the implementation is difficult, and as you said, even if it is a kind of handy law, so the platforms do not react the way actually as everyone expected them to do so. And the question is, okay, is this then an appropriate tool to handle this challenge? But before we go in that direction, so since we don't have this time, we had not discussed too much about cybersecurity, I would like to loop in Liger, since you mentioned in the beginning that this is your specific focus. So there has been a dramatic increase in cyber attacks, and specifically ransomware attacks over the past year and a half. So this alongside the rise of disinformation. So what trends in general, and maybe specifically then also what have you observed during the German election campaigns is so specific, or what's the state of play when it comes to cyber attacks on democracies right now? What are you seeing from the platform side?
Okay, there's some things that change over time and some things that stay very much the same. So the weaponization of the information landscape is just is something that's ongoing. But finding the most vulnerable points in which to attack is certainly something that criminals or nation-state actors do very, very well. And whether it's adapting to manipulating the pandemic together with elections or different issues that come up, all of the malicious actors are very quick to react. So what we've seen, particularly in the case of Germany, is not necessarily surprising. As I'm not sure which speaker said it before, it's not the election that gets attacked necessarily anymore. It's all of the parts that support an election, that inform the electorate, that really influence the voter. And in Germany itself, the top 5 points of attack that we've measured on through our services are definitely the NGOs. Government remains an attack zone, and think tanks. Those are the top 3 that we see activity in. And what's quite disturbing is that we see successful attacks growing. 35% of attacks in Germany over the last few years have been successful attacks on these top
what is the definition? What is the definition of success in this context? So, which means they penetrated the system.
The systems.
Okay.
Yeah, which sometimes is a smaller detail, but sometimes can be quite substantial. From the groups that we've identified that are linked to these attacks, it's certainly Russia and to a less extent Iran that have been paying attention in Germany. And those are divided into different actors, but 5 different particular actors, 3 from Russia, 3 from Russia and 2 from Iran that have been focusing on Germany. So in looking at this information and trying to piece everything together that we can, we need to have, hand in hand with, digital services are used so much more. So we try to see those vulnerable organizations that support democratic processes, not-for-profit organizations. We've been paying much more attention to provide free or much less expensive services to protect against cyber attacks. We've, in the past, ever since the attacks on the US election in 2016, we've very much been focusing on working with political candidates and different parties to make sure that that affordability of services isn't the problem, that they have the services, the maximum protection they could have on email and other Microsoft services that's possible. And of course, reaching out to healthcare industry, so this kind of thing that's sitting on the periphery that's under such attack doesn't cause or is protected as well. Human rights organizations, journalists, this kind of thing. One thing that was very interesting that I'd like to myself reflect on is older people and pensioners. I'm not sure that we've been addressing this as much as we can, and what kind of organizations or what kind of services they use and how are they perhaps a different sector. So I can't say that we have an account guard for pensioners or Microsoft security for pensioner associations, but I'm very curious to see if this is something that we could look into a bit more targeted, because these risks indeed, I hear the same thing from older grandparents or these older people that say that they really are the most vulnerable point of attack. And in any case, we have to go about with sort of a train the trainer approach, because it's really on the individual level. It's so easy to influence so many people with one particular piece of disinformation, but to have them change their minds takes so much more effort. So making sure that the groups that we work with are then prepared to pass this information on is kind of the train the trainer approach we try to instill when we work with various groups, especially on election security.
Great, and that's also a perfect bridge to the first question from the audience. Didi Kirsten Tadler from the German Council on Foreign Relations, who is a distinguished China expert, is exactly asking about, okay, elections are an integral part of democracies and a moment in time, but so what's the longer term effect and the deeper political influencing and interfering strategy? And Lutz, you already mentioned this, that actually election interference and this kind of disinformation operations are, so there's a peak in election times, but actually it's a 24/7, 365 days a year operation to change the minds, as you just said, Liger, of people in specific countries. So, and Didi is of course very much interested in what we have observed when it comes to Chinese influence and influence of the Chinese Communist Party, so which has obviously a different playbook than the Russians. And the question is if any of you at the panel actually want to take this one. But I will maybe collect the other ones too, and then we go one round before we then turn to the European dimension, and maybe there, or I'm sure that these questions will come up there again. Elvis Zornig is asking about Facebook comments in Facebook. Okay, I need to read that out. So it's a bit complicated. Sorry, I don't get the question right now. Maybe someone can help me. But Martina Brunswick-Timmerman, she has an interesting question, because she's referring to the fact that we had a very poor performance of the election authorities in Berlin, so the state of Berlin, and that of course also undermined the credibility of the Berlin election result. And she asked the important question, so was that floor election in Berlin actually, was that a result of foreign interference and influence, or just simply incompetence? And so since I'm a Berlin-based citizen, Martina, I can say that I'm very unfortunately, I think the later one is the answer. But you're absolutely right, because she mentioned, and she also refers in her question, that of course, even if this is just pure incompetence, it will be misused by Russia in their propaganda when we try to hold them accountable on their election interference, that that even the German authorities on the ground actually are not really doing a proper job, and that a lot of dubious activities had taken place there. Although, so for everyone who's not following that case too close, so both the head of the Berlin election authorities as well as the Federal Election Commissioner both took the case so they processed it on a legal way. So there will be investigation on this if the mistakes made in specific election offices were so severe that it had an impact on the result, and if there needs to be an intervention actually, and maybe even a snap election on in specific districts. So, but that's another thing. So, but the question, maybe let's focus on the Chinese question. So, and maybe Lutz, since you are, as you corrected me, you're right. So, since that's your specific focus, what's coming from the outside? What do we know about the Chinese playbook when they're trying to interfere in European democracies?
Thank you, Olaf. And I think Viola has also very specific views on that one, and a good insight as well, because that was discussed in the committee kind of at length as well. But can I just make one little point beforehand? We need to be careful with kind of always seeing everything in danger, because there is a wonderful term, I think even Facebook uses it itself. It's called perception hacking. Perception hacking is even a small, minuscule operation that is actually not so successful, can be a sort of token, can also be a part of this disinformation if you want to use it, because it suggests or it gives the overall suggestion that the elections were not fair or something. So we need to be careful in being alert and prepared, but at the same time not kind of having everything immediately at a major systemic risk. That doesn't take anything away from what we said so far, but it's an important element. Second point on your and I come to the point of Chinese related actors, but this interplay between cyber and disinformation and other techniques actually puts again back the question of do we have the right terms for what we're describing here? We in our work, I think some of you know this, and sorry to repeat this here, prefer actually the term information manipulation, because that is what it is. It's the information space that is manipulated with very different elements. It can be the content, that is usually called disinformation, but it can also be the identities, and it can be the technical elements for the reach and for the way kind of things are done. And that brings me to what we have already described and what many others kind of confirm, is that a lot of the Chinese-based kind of actors seem to use a very different approach, and that is not so much spreading a specific narrative, but it's much more to influence, to interference in long term. It's much more kind of to control certain conversations that might be about specific conversations, might be about specific elements. But this is something I think we need to invest much more in our overall kind of analytical capacity, because we see it in many European member states happening. Kind of anecdotal evidence of these elements. Voices are suppressed. People are intimidated, also online. And I think there is a trend. And that trend is not so much about, as I said, disinformation, about spreading your own view, but it's more about controlling the overall conversation. And that would be a new dimension of disinformation. That is not about true or false, but this is actually about how much freedom of expression do we still have in our own kind of constituency with this. So that is a trend I think we need to watch very, very carefully. And we have seen a couple of instances. I cannot quantify it so far, but these are elements that are high on our radar screen.
Okay. No, before I ask the next question, so Viola, as Lutz mentioned, actually, so you and the Inge committee looked a lot into Chinese influence. So what was your conclusion so far?
Well, I mean, the conclusion is that China invests increasingly into, as Lutz has mentioned, manipulation of information, but also very strategically now they have used, for example, the COVID crisis, as they have been trying to portray themselves as a superior nation, and they have handled it much more, I would say, resolute. No COVID numbers after a certain time. They have delivered all the equipment. They have been providing the mask, the equipment, the vaccination first, and so on. And especially, let's say, in bilateral relations, that worked out relatively well. When you know, I mean, the whole story, how it all started and how much resistance there was in China to even have a fact-finding mission on the origin of COVID. They have really turned the page in that respect, and they have invested heavily on this reputational gain. And actually, I'm not so sure how much that paid off. I think the Russians tried as well in a very, let's say, costly way. But now what I've heard, the opposite went true. It's not that the Sputnik vaccination was so successful, but because the political elite and the society elite of Russia is not allowed to travel with Sputnik, neither with Sinopharm, Putin in the end will have to buy the certified vaccination from the West, so that his elite can travel freely without restriction to the European Union. So that was a little bit of a boomerang. But regarding China, I mean, the whole diplomacy, they are like wolves now on Twitter. They really attack people. That has completely shifted. You cannot find any nation who is so well trained on Twitter and attack so targeted critics and try to mute them, try to silence them. And I mean, they have done this with travel bans when it came to the Uyghurs. They do this on certain other issues. I don't know how successful this is, but this is kind of, I think it will lead to a censorship, to a self-censorship in some countries where you have only some individuals working on China and actually rely on bilateral relation, that they can visit China, that they have research exchange and so on. And if they are a tiny little bit critical, they are out. They will never have a chance to travel to China. And so they think twice before they say something, before they critique anything, before they, I mean, just speak normal with their partners in their countries. And this is increasingly a problem on the research area, but also in a political area. I think times will become more and more decoupled. We will see this in the political field when the Americans try to push us, I think for a good reason, that we should take a position, but this will make our life extremely difficult. And we see that in the European Union, China is more or less successful in dividing us. So they have invested a lot in the bilateral relation with the 16+1. 17 was before, now Lithuania has withdrawn, but nevertheless, there's a big group of states which are rather happy to have stronger relations and get this investment. I mean, this is maybe in most of the cases, this is a very costly investment, a costly loan, a costly credit. And many of those Western Balkan states have woken up now and found themselves in a terrible death trap. They don't know how to come out. Montenegro, for example, asked the European Union for reshuffling those loans. I think we were good, we are right, we did so. We helped out with 4 international banks, but there was, let's say, a huge maneuver. North Macedonia, Bosnia, they're in a similar situation. So the citizens pay for the corruption of the political elite, but China plays that extremely well and goes into this niche where we are either, I mean, I'm for this, but of course our investment comes with a lot of conditionality, and we are slow, and maybe it's not the overall package. So in that respect, China is much more flexible. They are on the ground, they do the job, and the result is then being paid by those states. And this is a heavy package.
Okay, no, that's important. And also, since you mentioned the blacklisting of critical voices, so maybe as a disclaimer, the very host of this meeting, our Alliance of Democracies Foundation, had been among those civil society organizations, together with our dear friends from the Merix Institute in Berlin, to be blacklisted in response to the European sanctions put on China. So we are one of the our staff is one of the institutions who could not travel to China for the time being. So therefore, we we feel the pain. But there was the good thing where there were no travel plans at all. It is super interesting. But let's turn to what's coming next. So because I have a couple of questions we want to discuss, I give the floor again shortly to my colleague Carlo, who will run us through the presentation of our recommendations we gave to the German government and the German parliament, so what they might think about to do in the future. But a lot of this also applies to the European level, and the question we will then enter is what's next. So what is the dimension of the Digital Services Act? And there are a couple of other drafts on political ads and the strengthened code of practice on disinformation, which are super interesting and I think very important, and also the questions from the audience coming in. So therefore, let's not waste any time. Carlo, take us through the recommendations, and then we get back to the panel and the audience questions.
Thank you very much, Olaf. And as you rightly said, these recommendations do not only apply to the new German government, but can equally be applied to any member state within the European Union, and also, of course, on a European level. First, the role of the Bundestag, or in general, the parliament, is immensely important in regard to protecting against election interference. MPs are the targets of many election interference campaigns, but they're also, from a legislative perspective, of course, those responsible to strengthen the integrity of democracy. In the Bundestag, at least, there are numerous committees which already individually deal with questions of election integrity from a variety of perspectives, but a centralized institutional exchange within the parliament containing of all the relevant MPs from the relevant committees, which meet on a regular and ad hoc basis, would be something that we think is beneficial. In general, improving the general awareness of parliamentarians about the dangers of these threats is also important. 40% of the Bundestag is made up of new, firstly elected MPs. So we think that there is a big group of individuals which may have not yet received the training that Liga was talking about in regard to cybersecurity, which may have not received the training on how to respond to a disinformation campaign and how to react to it. So training these MPs is critical. Also on a local level, you're only as strong as your weakest link, especially in regard to cyber attacks which target your supporter in your office, in your local constituency, but thereby may gain access to the entire system. So we need to train from the top to the bottom. The second component that we think is important is to ensure that there's a continuous analysis on election interference. From the executive level, we think that the establishment of an election integrity commission would be beneficial. In Germany, this could, for example, be led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of the Interior, and have the mandate to identify and assess the extent of existing but also anticipated threats, and to develop a holistic whole of government approach in order to promote the country's resilience against such attacks. Unlike the institutional exchange that I mentioned before in the parliament, this would be led by the executive, providing the government with the necessary tools to actively prevent election interference in the future. Simultaneously, greater investment in research on the threats is needed. Technology is changing, but as we just discussed, tactics are changing as well. To understand the nature of the threat is very important. So investments for research, of course, for academia is critical, but also for civil society organizations which are present here and very much contributed also to the research that was done after the election in regard to what threats we saw is important. But also the private sector, especially in regard to big data analysis or narrative mapping, where they, with their technology, can offer something that maybe academia and the civil society cannot. In general, we would like and wish and hope for increased transparency about the threat situation. There's, of course, some secrecy necessary and inevitable, but a heightened transparency would be better for the German public, but the civil society, the parliament, to understand what threats there are. In the German election, we had a very, very consistent announcement made by the Federal Election Commissioner on what threats there were. The BSI, the institution responsible for the cybersecurity of the federal government, also published attacks. This on a regular basis, also outside of elections, would be beneficial. We will talk about this now in greater detail, but in general, the lack of clear rules on digital election campaigning, among other things, contributes to the ease with which disinformation can travel through the media ecosystem. As mentioned by Felix, there were several self-commitments made by the civil society, but also by the parties themselves, but they were not able to agree on a joint code of conduct. So in our opinion, it is indispensable that at the latest by the next federal election, there needs to be a clear understanding of what is permissible in the digital sphere when it comes to campaigning. At the European level, there are several legislative packages which are currently being discussed, in particular, of course, the DSA, which will be delved into greater detail now, but also transparency for political advertisement or the strengthened EU conduct on disinformation are worth mentioning here. We hope and we believe that there will be a clear support from the German government regarding these legislative packages, that they pass quickly and they pass with a big mandate, and that in general, a European-wide approach is found in order to tackle election integrity in the coming years. We also just talked about it from a cybersecurity perspective. Liga mentioned it. In general, it is time that our society becomes digitally fit. We looked at it from a digital media literacy perspective, but of course, cybersecurity training is just as important, with a targeted approach from young to old. And these were our recommendations for the new German government. And with that, I will give it back to you, Olaf.
Thank you very much, Carlo. And as I already said, so I think they very much apply also to the European level. So this is nothing specific to Germany. And also, so since there's in the chat this interesting conversation on media literacy and specific target groups like pensioners and elder people, that was exactly what we also observed. And the example you shared with us, Viola, was a common example. I also listened into in very private, a lot of private conversations that exactly grandparents, older parents actually are involved in actually non-political WhatsApp groups, and then someone shares this kind of information. There's no fact checking. There's no one actually capable to debunk these kind of issues, and then they spread. And the question is really, what are our approaches to this? But before we turn to this very interesting aspect, so let me quickly jump in and take the buzzword from Carlo on the DSA, and knowing that Viola needs to leave, unfortunately, it's still a Strasbourg week for the European Parliament, and we're grateful that you spared the time actually to join us here. So as a parliamentarian, and specifically with your background as a member of the INGE committee, so you are the one of those actually who really have that clear idea of the urgency of the issue. So are we moving in the right direction with the DSA? So we had the debate on the Digital Markets Act just this week, and I think it went into the right direction. So, but there was more the competition element and the dominance of the platforms from a market aspect. So the DSA, of course, tackles exactly what we just talked about. And would the implementation and the adoption of the DSA solve all the problems we just discussed, or how would you explain what the DSA about and what it's capable to achieve to the pensioner actually who came up with the pet fake narrative?
No, sure. I mean, the DSA should exactly, hopefully, fill this gap. So greater democratic control and oversight of this systematic false information on platforms. This is one thing. The other thing is mitigation of systematic risks, especially such as this manipulation of information in a broader sense. We need to have vetting, and this is included here, vetting credentials of third parties, suppliers. And of course, we need like content checkers in a more systematic approach. So this trusted flaggers. But for me, I think since I'm more a member of Inge, I think we should also, and Carlo has mentioned that, look a little bit at the institutional setup. I guess it is interesting to link it to the Foreign Office, but on the European level, at least we Greens would like to have it a little bit out of a diplomacy, would like to increase and to strengthen the mandate of Stratcom, where Lutz is the director, and also give it a more independent voice, take it out of let's say the influence of a Russian desk officer in the external action service, or Chinese desk officer, who of course have a different interest than disclosing this information on those bigger players. And have a broader, let's say, variety on different states, more languages represented, strengthen that, have the independent and also better coordination with the member states. And this would, of course, interlink to what Carlo has presented. Make sure that each and every member state has a similar at least structure where Stratcom people could connect to, have an understanding of what Stratcom does and how they can disseminate those information in their mother tongue, in the different languages throughout the European public space. Because right now, I think they do a great job, but not many people are aware of that. Not many people consume and, let's say, use that. And how do we increase this? How do we make it as a priority for all executive bodies in the European Union, and how do we make it more independent from European institutions who also have a different role in that play? And this will be all found then in our final report in the Inge committee, which probably, I mean, you have seen the draft, and now we are working, or the rapporteur does work with the 1,200 amendments. She will come up with most of the compromised amendments probably the beginning of January. Then we will negotiate and probably have a vote in February or something like this. So this is, I would say, as important as the Digital Service Act, but I know my colleagues are pretty happy that at least the European Parliament and the European Commission try to tackle the business model and the usual business model. Try to get this political advertising, targeted advertising, what Felix has said as well, to completely have more accountability, more scrutiny on this, and even reduce the criteria on which micro-targeted is possible. So to exclude sex, ethnicity, and religion, for example, things like this, and also disclose, of course, the algorithm and push the platforms for this.
That's very interesting. And also, so in a reference to what we recommended to the German Bundestag, would you recommend to your colleagues on the national level to also install something like the Inge committee on the national level? Would that make sense also to as a catalyst actually within the parliamentary community, just to raise the awareness? Because that was one of the conclusions, as Carlo mentioned, we came up with that in our direct reach out to all members and candidates to the Bundestag. There was a huge interest in, okay, just feed us with information. What are we talking about? Do you have numbers? So can you, and we did some media training also and some cyber election training in cooperation with the Microsoft office in Berlin, to just give people a better understanding of what is it when we talk about disinformation or cyber attacks in the context of elections. So would you agree that this is?
I would say temporarily for 1 or 2 years, not an Untersuchungsausschuss, but rather an Unterausschuss, so a subcommittee linked to the Foreign Affairs Committee with a certain group of hearings to different topics, as we have set up that would be great. If you have the right chairman for this, if you have a good group and committed group of parliamentarians, this would help a lot. And then from there on, you can work on a strategy. But yes, I think this is more than needed. As you have mentioned, and as Carlo has mentioned, Germany was and will be the main target on the next elections as well. So it's better to get prepared, and not just one party and not just one, let's say, think tank, but rather in a more broader public space, discuss that with the colleagues would be absolutely appropriate. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Sorry, it's 11:05, so I know you need to leave. So we wish you all the best, and thanks very much for joining us. And I'm sure we will continue the conversation next year. Thanks, Viola. Maybe on the DSA, so let me also chip in you, Lutz, and Felix. So since you both also are focusing on specific aspects of this, so what is your general take right now? Where are we? Are we moving in the right directions? And as I ask a little bit as a agent provocateur, so would this really fix all the questions and issues we just flagged, or is it at least a good point of start, or a starting point actually, so to continue the debate, because more elements need to be added? So what's your perspective?
Felix first, I first. I go first. I think we have a little nuance, Felix and I. You will hear this in a moment. But first of all, I think the TSA is a very good thing. We need to see it in connection with a code of practice, of course, which is a non-binding, but nevertheless, kind of from its approach, very, very thought through kind of instrument that we have developed here at European level, as far as how do we spell out how these obligations could look like. The DSA is, of course, then the legally binding instrument in there. And I think these two ideas that are in there, and I think most of the attendees are familiar with this. Number one is more transparency, and number two is more accountability of the platforms is crucial, because these two things are missing. And then to have a clear kind of this idea of not regulating the content, but of regulating the risk, and not regulating, but of developing risk assessment kind of approaches, with an obligation for the platforms to develop these with a third-party independent oversight. I think it's still a very, very solid construction. And if I can say this, very different from the NetzDG, in the sense. But to be fair, the NetzDG is about something else. It's about illegal content. And here we speak about the non-illegal issues. And that is so difficult. How can you regulate something that is not forbidden, where there are no real laws against? And that's why I think this risk assessment is crucial. Second point is, we need to move away from discussing disinformation as content only. Yes, content is an important indicator. It's the behavior that is behind there. And I think we need to get closer to the ideas of the cyber world. It's kind of who's manipulating, which tools are being used, how is this done? So it's not a mere technical thing, but the different techniques, the different protocols, the different tactics that are being used are so important. If it's false identities, if it's kind of these amplification measures, this is the stuff that we need to look at. Otherwise, we are endlessly in a loop of discussing, who can say what is right and what is wrong, and it is a very normative load-in kind of element. And if I can just complete maybe
but attribution. Yeah. So how do you deal with the issue of attribution? Because that's the most challenging part in the cyber and disinformation. So it's not that obvious and clear to identify.
You're absolutely right. And our life will become even more difficult in the future, because the trends show us it's not anymore the state actors that we can kind of identify relatively easily, but it is shifting towards new models. Commercial actors, PR agencies that all of a sudden do the Strohmann, the intermediary. I don't have a good answer for that, but I think we need a solid, what do we call the techniques and tactics and procedures, the TTPs. We need a solid understanding, a solid technical understanding, and that's why all our work internationally, or starting at the EU, of course, in terms of having a good grasp of what, from a kind of analytical perspective, defines this information manipulation. That is the only way to go to attribution, I think. And of course, in parallel, we need the regulation also on the illegal content. No.
But then I interpreted this as the support form of what Viola said, that we need these institutions which are really looking into the interference aspect. So, and maybe to mention that the Swedish government is just one of the first, actually. They will have on January 1st the Swedish agency for
Olaf,
psychological.
if I can cite another member state, and I don't want to take Felix's speaking time away, but it's our French colleagues,
Exactly, a lot of French.
Very, very reluctant about this area, about freedom of expression, who have, first of all, redefined their security strategy. Number two, built a new agency that is doing a lot what my team is doing, but in a very, very clearly defined legal framework and oversight and control. And government structures. And I think these elements should really be an example also for the new federal government, for the Bundesregierung, to see how do you piece this together. Because just leaving the departments kind of cooperating, I mean, we have seen it here on European level. It depends a lot of factors, and it can go terribly wrong because it is not creating that. Last thought, I personally, and I have to underline personally, I'm a big fan of what Viola said in terms of also creating a structure. I think it should be a sort of European center, that is connecting all these activities, that is bringing together these insights and the research, because this is something that is missing. And the more the member states are now investing in this, in slightly different structures, the more we need to connect it to be successful.
Great. Oh, great point. And as Lutz said, so Felix, coming to the discussion actually, so since you have that specific focus on the role of social media platforms, so are you satisfied with what's in the DSA, and would we get the platforms actually become part of the solution instead of being part of the problem with the DSA?
Well, Lutz already mentioned all the buzzwords that make my world go round: to transparency, accountability. I think the framework as presented now is ambitious, and it will depend, of course, as with the GDPR and previous legislative endeavors, on the degree of enforcement capacity and will as well in the end. But I think there's a lot in substance. A lot of civil society actors were upset that the DSA now doesn't include a general ban on personalized ads advertising. I'm not sure that the DSA would have been the right place for that in the first place, and even I'm not sure whether it's technically possible to ban personalized advertising, but I'm not an expert on that. In general, I think it's absolutely desirable and much welcome to kind of revert the burden of proof and define broader public policy objectives or societal risks that we or a regulator expect the companies to address, and then basically to put the burden on companies to prove that they're taking sufficient measures to address those risks and to mitigate harm. But as I said, it's all about enforcement. I also very much think that the provisions on research and data access more broadly, also for CSO beyond like strictly defined academic organizations, is very good and important. Very often when we do these panels as well, of course, we talk about kind of abstract and vague notions of threats or societal challenges, simply because there is not enough empirical evidence to measure them and to define them. And that is because these platforms, and Facebook in particular, Google as well, are incredibly opaque, and they do these like flagship academic cooperations, but in the end, it's the academics who walk away in agony and say that they feel like they've been basically screwed over. because there is no genuine will to provide transparency, and that makes perfect sense, of course, from a company perspective as well. So I'm very happy that the DSA intends to basically make the decisions on how data access is administered a public one that is no longer only up to private actors. One example, for instance, from the German election project that we run, we funded the University of New York, NYU, for a big project on increasing transparency of political advertising ahead of the elections. They created a huge database. They had their research associates hired. Everything was geared up and ready to go. And then Facebook, at a whim, basically decided to delete the accounts for those researchers, and basically the whole election project was dead. And I can assure you that if there is
algorithm watch in Germany,
algorithm watch experience, very same thing. Exactly. And if there is a definition of good faith researchers, those teams would definitely have fulfilled it and complied with it. So that's just one very practical example for why I think the provisions on research access and transparency are so vital in the DSA.
But then let me get Liga you into it. So because you are overseeing all the activities on the European Democracy Action Plan, which was actually the framework for all these different measures we're talking about, and also so because you mentioned that the political ad issue is not addressed specifically in the DSA. Maybe it's important to share that Vice President Jourova presented a new draft specifically just on regulation for political ads just 2 weeks ago, which is interesting. And so maybe even there, not sufficient for some, but I think it has already a lot of important elements in it. But there's also another element which is called, it was called in the beginning, the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which was a clear multi-stakeholder process which should involve the tech industry, and Microsoft was also a part of this, although you don't have a social media network, so therefore you are not maybe in the middle of the focus like Facebook and Twitter and others had been. But now actually there's the strengthened Code of Practice on Disinformation, which also invites these environment of other groups like WhatsApp, so which had not been in the focus in the very beginning. So from an industry perspective, so how do you assess this process, or could this be the forum which Felix also mentioned, so where we have a serious conversation between industry, politics, and civil society on what are the key challenges we jointly need to address?
A lot of questions in that statement, Olaf.
I'll try
to unpack that.
No.
At the same time, I've been collecting a lot of points that I wanted to reply to Lutz and Felix about some of the comments they made. So I'll try to package that all together in a way that makes sense.
Go ahead, you have 10 minutes.
I may not need 10 minutes, but one thing I wanted to address, kind of pointing at your question, is what Lutz already mentioned, this idea that we have to use the right terms for what we're talking about. And what we're talking about goes much wider than social media platforms. So information manipulation and the constant attention to new technologies coming out that can be used for information manipulation, and how many services can be used inadvertently. And in the process of developing those new technologies, we have to be very alert from the beginning about how they could be misused, whether it's on the content that can be provided, identities and misuse of identities, or the tech elements. So I would say there's a dramatic upswing in innovation on different kinds of technologies that could be misused, and that's been addressed in many ways. But it's also positive to see that the Code of Practice that you mentioned in your question has seen many more organizations joining, and that by itself is a small piece of success, because I think we were talking about the elderly before and how this is a big problem for disinformation. But if I think about how quickly my own children adapt to different social media platforms and are using things that I haven't even heard of, these are all this constant switch to different social media platforms and involving more smaller industry players in these discussions is also something that's very key. So we're happy that new signatories are expanded, and that I hope this gets attention to a wider set of industries as well. One thing I wanted to mention is on On back to attribution, we certainly, as a private organization, we still have to go through quite vigorous scrutiny of what we put out on attribution. And this is a bit different from the question you asked, but I wanted to mention it, that we have been very much coming forward with identifying state-sponsored actors that have been not necessarily behaving as they could and have been conducting malicious activity in cyberspace. But we see that this is something that certainly has to be taken forward in the private sector as well. We are currently very much looking at the private sector offensive actors as well and what could be done in this space. So maybe that's for next time for discussion, but something that should be marked as a bit of an up-and-coming topic.
No, absolutely. And that's also something we observed in recent months, that indeed, as you mentioned, so there's kind of a privatization also of this disinformation business. So on the one hand, we all know you can hire disinformation now by so-called black PR. That's the one thing. But then also there are a couple of, or at least there's one specific new network, which is not state run, but it is more political motivated, which is, I would call the Trump banner network right now. So who are in a very proactive way supporting President Bolsonaro in Brazil, actually, to set up an election campaign, which is pretty much based on spreading disinformation and misusing the information and manipulating the information space for the sake of his re-election. And this is not done by China or by Russia or whatsoever. And of course, in that regard, we had seen it already that the main challenge for the US, so the 2020 elections were very different from the 2016 elections in terms of attribution to who was responsible for spreading misinformation. So all of a sudden, I guess, in the Kremlin, actually, they opened one Krim champagne after the other because they did not really needed to invest a lot of capacities to get the game going, because Trump and his campaign team actually did a lot to, until today, actually, I think a majority of Republican voters believe that the vote had been stolen from him because he was so successful in spreading this false narrative. And that's, of course, something which goes back to the question of media literacy, which was addressed in this conversation. And indeed, I also think we would need to set up a new conversation, because this is something which we had been interested as the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity and the Alliance of Democracies Foundation from the very beginning. So we first started to look into the issue of political deepfakes, which will be, by the way, also another event we will host in the beginning of next year, because there's kind of a new, so it was an issue at the beginning, then kind of it silenced a bit, but now we are back to the question, does political deepfake has the potential to be the mini nukes of the information age? Let's put it like this. No, but the question of media literacy is something we are very concerned about, and maybe I take the opportunity to ask my colleague Carlo to share very quickly his screen, because in cooperation with the Alfred Herrhausen Society, a German institution here, we produced, yeah, exactly. So maybe I explained why you shared. So we produced a set of infographics, although actually you could also call it illustrated text, with the intention of addressing specific questions from that election integrity bubble. So what is disinformation? We tackled in one of these two slides. What is media and news literacy in a political context? What are cyber attacks, and what do I need to know about malware attacks and phishing, and how does it work, and how have public institutions been affected by this? Then we explain in this one bubble on the left, actually, in 3 sentences, the hack on the Bundestag in 2015, or the hack on the CDU election convention when they voted for a new chairman. We addressed the role of social media platforms and the integrity of elections, and how it is connected. And that was a very general experiment we started to figure out, but then over the course of this, actually, we also really realized, okay, it needs way more specific, way more tools specified to specific target groups, because it is so much complex, and the communication ways in these different groups are also, so if I talk to my younger children, actually, I don't need to talk about Facebook or Twitter because they are never there, but we need to talk about Snapchat and TikTok, and disinformation is also happening on these platforms. And so in that regard, maybe to stop my monologue and bring in others, the question also, as we mentioned at the very beginning, so how do we manage to have this broader perspective beyond Facebook and Twitter? So when it comes to the different channels, so how do we handle this growing scenery of different platforms which are misused? So is it important to address each of them individually, or as you mentioned, Lutz, actually, is it really more a systemic or a strategic approach which needs to be reset to have a different perspective on, and then it doesn't matter actually what platform comes up next?
Wow, it's a difficult question. It's of course the big issue is, can you regulate or not? You know, you can always call on these platforms, you can always invite them. But I think what is really the big issue here in the future is, if the DSA comes into effect and if it works, etc., it will only look at the big platforms, of course. What do we do with the cross-platform issues? What do we do with the campaigns that are below a certain threshold? And I have my colleague Patrice Wangen also here among the attendees, who has done a lot of work on this. And this is our big issue, you know. In the future, they might just slip under the radar, you know, these campaigns. Then you might say, but if they're under the radar, they are not so successful. And that is the big question of the future, because here also we will move away from the big scale kind of wholesale, big time kind of campaigns to very kind of targeted strikes, let's call it like this, against very specific or targeting very specific audiences. And to be honest, we don't have very good answers for this at the moment. My take, and I think I can speak here also for Viola, because she made the point, is we need, and I think Felix agrees with this, you know, we need to invest in this analytical capability, and not only on the governmental side, but also in the civil society. Because if we don't have this clear understanding, what is it that is happening and what not, without that, we cannot do anything. Otherwise, we continue to discuss anecdotal evidence, normative loaded concepts, etc. I think we made a great progress over the past 2-3 years, also helped to a lot of Felix's organization that is supporting this type of issue. I see others also here among the attendees, whatever, Democracy International, etc., etc. Reporting International, sorry. And this is the way we need to go, really building this network with NGOs, with industry, governments. And last element here, sorry, that doesn't really answer your question, but I think we also need to distinguish. There are issues or activities where we need to invest in the resilience of audience. So this is very much the downstream work. There are plenty of activities. You mentioned media literacy, awareness raising, all these things need to happen, but they don't stop the production of disinformation, or the activity of information manipulation. And on the other hand, we really need to also focus more and more on kind of what instruments do we have, either internal or even foreign policy instruments, to address kind of the production of this manipulation. DSA is one little element, or this disruption kind of element, so to look at the spread. But we also need to further look into the future. You know, are there not other instruments that allow us to impose costs, to deter more, etc.? We have a couple of ideas. They're not yet 100% ripe. They're not yet kind of konsensfähig, not yet consensual. But I think this is the way we should also structure the debate: resilience and kind of looking at the upstream production and dissemination. I think that helps us to put a bit of order as well.
Absolutely, and I also think so. One question which struck me recently is that so we talked a lot about the DSA now. This is the European approach to tackle the issue. So, but in parallel, so we see in Great Britain, so unfortunately not any longer part of the EU, they come up with the online safety bill. So another approach with a duty of care element in it as the main aspect to hold platforms accountable. In the US is an ongoing debate on a reform of the Section 230, which is called the basic law of the internet, which in the very beginning was the precondition actually for flourishing innovative technology sector, which brought us where we are right now. But of course, also lawmakers in the US have their concerns. Australia is coming up with legislation on parts of these issues. So the question is the tendency we observe right now that every region or individual nation countries actually coming up with their national legislation, is this the right approach? Or maybe we should also need kind of a forum actually where we jointly debate this kind of issues. And in that regard, I think from the Biden Summit for Democracy last week was an interesting signal coming that these are issues actually which need to be addressed, and we need to include all democracies across the world, because they are all faced with the same challenge. And I just mentioned pretty much Western countries, but of course also the global South needs to be in this. And the Secretary General of the United Nations also put it in his common agenda that the integrity of the information space is actually a global good which needs to be protected, and we need creative and smart solutions to this. So therefore, there's a lot of points we can continue the conversation. Unfortunately, we are at the end of a 90 minutes super interesting debate we had. So I thank you very much, Lutz Göhner, Viola von Kramon, who already left, Felix Gart, and also Liga for Microsoft to be part of this. I would like to thank on behalf of our foundation everyone who signed up for this event and joined us. We recorded this session. And we will upload it on YouTube and our different social media channels. So if you follow our Twitter feed, then you will see as soon as the video is available, actually you can listen into many of these interesting quotes made by participants here. And I promise that we will continue this conversation also next year and following, because we're not at all at the end of the conversation, but we're just in the middle of it, and it's very interesting. And as we mentioned, has a lot of paths we can take to dive deeper into that specific areas. All ideas and also recommendations on what aspects we should tackle on. So we're always very grateful for your input. You can use our social media channels. And with this, without further ado, I leave this. Thank you all again. I wish you a wonderful week, and I wish you a great and relaxing break. And then we see each other at latest in 2022.